boy, do we have a guest of guests today. It's a plethora of riches in terms of our guest today. Andy Paul is really one of the top 10 thought leaders on professional B2B sales today out there. He's made the LinkedIn list of top influencers. In fact, he's number 8 on that list. He runs an amazing podcast called Accelerate. And Inc. magazine has actually identified that podcast as one of the top leadership podcasts in the world. And here's the amazing part. He's done 950 something episodes. So he's had 950 conversations with sales thought leaders and people who are deep in this space about elevating B2B sales performance. In addition to that, Andy has written 2 spectacular bestsellers, Zero Time Selling and Amp Up Your Sales. As you folks know, I read a lot of sales books. I love it. Andy's far more well-read than I am. These books are excellent. These are books to pick up today and read today. And what I really like about the way Andy positions these things is that he does take what can be viewed as a complex world of B2B selling, and he simplifies it in terms of strategies that you can apply for your business and your industry today. That's what we're all about. So today, when we bring Andy on, we're going to ask him a few questions here. One of the first questions I'm going to ask Andy, by the way, is how Chip Taylor's University of Oregon, football strategy about speeding up plays, so they had the ball, more offensive plays in a given game, how that ends up translating into the theme for a book or a sales process. That's referenced in Zero Time. I'm also very interested in Andy's view on what the biggest challenges are in professional selling today. It's probably going to be one of our first questions to Andy. I'm going to talk to Andy as well about the different buyers out there today and how he's defined, the A and B, a satisfizer or a maximizer in terms of the buyers out there today. But most importantly, one of the things we're going to talk to Andy about is why he believes that how you sell is actually more important than what you sell. That you control your destiny as a professional salesperson. So how you sell is actually more important than what you sell. And when you look at Andy's credentials, by the way, which are just incredible, one of the things I love is the story that back in the day, when Andy left Wisconsin, went to university, got his first job outside of university with Burroughs, and went to his sales training. Imagine this, his first job. He gets sent back from the sales training 3 weeks later to go to the regional office that he works at with an envelope. He gives the envelope to his boss as he was told, and his boss opens the envelope. Opens the envelope and says, "They told me I should fire you." Can you imagine that happening to anybody? Imagine the impact of your first job getting fired 2 weeks in. Now, people have been wrong. I make a lot of mistakes, but here's the sales trainer who actually picked somebody, said he's never going to make it in sales. He's too analytical. And here we are now where he's one of the top 10 thought leaders globally. So Andy, if you're out there, please turn on your camera, come and join us. Welcome to the show.
Mark, thank you very much for that very kind introduction.
So first of all, Andy, I got to say, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah,
so
I made it one more year.
I can't believe you're actually spending your birthday with us. So what kind of special treats do you end up giving yourself on your birthday? Like, is this a few craft beers and you watch a Liverpool game?
Actually, I have meetings until 9:30 tonight.
That's not much of a birthday, Andy.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on being on the East Coast on my birthday, but it sort of turned out that way. So actually, a meeting that was supposed to start at 5 p.m. on the West Coast, but I'm out here, so it's going to start at 8:30. But yeah, we went out to dinner last night, my wife and I, and sat outside at a restaurant, which was great, here in Manhattan, down in the Village, and had a great time.
Got it. And you split your time between Manhattan and San Diego. And how are things in Manhattan these days? Opening up a little bit, things getting a little bit more back to normal?
Yeah, actually, this trip is the first time I've been back in 15 months. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. So even though my wife's work is out here, we hadn't been coming back. She'd come back a couple times, but it's seems like it's coming back to speed. I mean, one thing I noticed, like the first day as I was walking around, is just how many of my favorite little hangouts are gone.
No.
Yeah, my favorite poke restaurant, my favorite little French pastry place, my favorite sandwich place. One other place just closed. So unfortunately, this thing hit hard and there are a bunch of casualties. But yeah, it feels like there's a fair amount of life in the city.
Well, that, good to see things moving in the right direction. It's interesting. We've just, on our end, we're getting the first requests now that say, hey, we want you to come and do some sales training for our organization, but you have to be here in person.
Yeah, it's starting to happen.
Yeah, up to now, we've been doing everything through virtual. We've been training everybody virtually for the last 18 months, which was a change for us. And now the next grouping are coming in and saying, hey, no, we're back to normal and this is face-to-face and we expect you to be in a room. So nice to see some of that taking place.
Well, actually, I believe this whole return to face-to-face is going to happen more quickly than people think.
Do you?
Yeah. I just think that there's a pent-up demand. I mean, I certainly wanted to, even though I love San Diego, but I'm accustomed to being here in New York and I really missed it. And it just felt great to be back. And I've got meetings lined up here with people face-to-face. So
great.
Yeah, I think there's enough happening, enough being written about sort of what could happen if we, start going back face to face. That I think people want to, right? I mean, people want to work with colleagues and so on.
I think they do. Well, you know what? I absolutely think they do. I think we're social creatures, and
yes.
I think we've missed a whole bunch of things over the last 18 months. We just, we're in a slightly different situation here. I'm based in Toronto in Canada. We're a little slower out of the gate, Andy, because we were a little slower to get vaccine.
Right.
But we've been pretty good about in terms of taking the vaccine. So things are opening up. And now that we can enjoy guests over again in the backyard and these types of things, changes your world. But there was a lot less of that over the last 6 months, prior. So it's been a while since we entertained.
Well, and I just think work-wise, there's even things this week, I think is New York Times, Wall Street Journal, I can't remember which one, article about what's going to happen in the hybrid workplace. And while certainly having that flexibility, I would love it if I weren't working for myself, but working for an organization that forced you to come in or want you to come in. I think hybrid would be great, but they're already talking about this sort of stratification of employees in the workforce by people who come in versus those who don't, and the disadvantages of not going into the office. I mean, you can try to legislate against the bias against people who don't come in, but human nature says the people that are here every day, the ones I talk to every day, do they have an advantage?
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? And you've seen far better than me all the large companies that have come out and said we're never coming back to the office. So,
well, mirrored by many now that said they are. Just we want to make sure everybody's vaccinated first, but I think you're going to see that trend accelerate. Quite frankly, I think it's I think the thing that's going to be left out of this is flexibility. Hopefully, management understands that when someone's not in the office, they can work. When you and I started work years and years and years ago, if you were in the office, the presumption, and probably a good presumption, is you're not working at home, right?
Right.
But we weren't connected in the same way. But now, someone. I got kids coming home early from school, but get stuff done, no problem, right? Just let that happen. And hopefully that flexibility remains. But I think that there's going to be a lot of pressures to go back.
Well, the other thing we'll get into, I think, Andy, is this flexibility in terms of running sales organizations today. You said, hey, I hope some flexibility remains out there. Certainly within our clients, it's a very unique world out there. I'm not seeing a lot of flexibility within professional sales. And I think it's a mistake. And folks, well, we'll get into a lot of this discussion, but let me fire to you the question that a few years ago you used to like to start your podcast with, and I thought it was a great one. And the question is, what are you seeing as the biggest challenge in professional sales today?
Mm-hmm. So, that's the question. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was listening for the punchline. I think it ties to what you're just talking about. Is sort of the. It's hard to rank these, but one thing that's top on my list is this pressure to conform, and certainly it's been accentuated by the fact we're using way more technology that gives us more transparency in what sellers are doing, but it's been used by leadership to say, yeah, let's put in place processes, and then we're going to, really focus on these metrics to ensure people conform to the specific way of doing things. And I think that's sort of the antithesis of what you want to do, which I think you have a process within which you give the people the flexibility to become the best version of themselves, not the best version of what somebody thinks is a top performer, right? And that seems much harder these days for managers to feel comfortable with, because they operate sort of from a position of fear. It's seemingly more than in the past, but I mean, it's always, your neck's always on the line to some degree. But this position of fear, then they sort of reflexively resort to, well, you got to do things this way, my way. And I think sellers have lost autonomy to grow and to develop and to experiment and to really, as I said, work to become the best version of themselves, which is really the best that we can ask of people.
Right. Where do you think within sales leadership today, and I've certainly got my thoughts and opinions, but where do you think all that fear is coming from? So when I actually personally believe that sales management is kind of the X factor of professional sales today. I think that one of the biggest challenges with salespeople is their managers don't have deep experience. They don't coach. And it isn't the same as it was for you and I 25 years ago, where we had a wonderful guide in many cases. The only way you got to where you are today is you probably had some pretty good leaders along the path to help you there and coach you and let you grow and enable some of that autonomy, right? Let you try a few different things. And I think sales management is a topic we'll get to in a few minutes here, but why are they facing so much fear?
Well, I think you nailed it, though. You said is they're generally inexperienced, and then they're not given the tools and the training and the coaching themselves. Yeah. And so it's like everything. We promote the people, and we expect them to be able to do this job for which they're not equipped or enabled. Yeah. And then we expect them to do it well quickly, just like we do as salespeople. And it's so what do you human nature says, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to resort to grasping at the things that give them a sense of control over what's happening. And that becomes these activity metrics and so on. And they don't feel like they have the experience oftentimes to give people a little leeway. Yeah, try that. That could be interesting, right? That sort of falls outside the bounds, but let people color outside the lines, as I like to say. And that's sort of compounded by the fact that, sellers go along with it. And I think that's a change. In my day, that, sort of the first, let's say 5-10 years of my career, is people seem less reluctant to sort of say, no, let me try things. Right. And I know I did. I'm tough, right? I always push back. It's because
I'm getting that sense, by the way.
Yeah. But I operated throughout my career and have operated as if, look, you can direct me to do something when I was in sales. You could, my boss, you could tell me to go do something a certain way. But if I do it and it doesn't work and I don't hit my numbers, who gets fired? Me or you? Right. I get fired. So, I respect what you're saying. I'm going to take in the input. But ultimately, the decision has to be mine in terms of how I'm going to approach this, because I hold myself accountable for it. Right. And I don't see enough of that. And there's, psychology of conformity that's out there that, you look at some of these SaaS sales organizations where, people are just sort of following along with this, tightly defined sales process. And just reading in a book saying that, if there were just one person, and I think it was in a group of 80, the research was, just one person said no, most of them would say no and change, right? That's all it takes. Is sellers have to learn how to grab control of their careers. And it's a tough thing. Your bosses may not like it, but if you have confidence that you can learn and deliver, then do it that way.
Well, I think you bring up a couple of really interesting points, and you talked about, they're just conforming. I think there's one data point, and again, your grasp of data is second to nobody's, but the churn is so high, particularly in entry-level sales. I'm not sure they're always conforming. I think they're sticking around for a couple of years, and as soon as they don't like the look of something, they're jumping over to the next company. And right now, the demand for professional salespeople is outstripping supply for quality salespeople by so much that they can't.
Well, so what's going to happen though, and this inevitably happens, is that people get into that pattern of making those changes quickly, and you reach a point where suddenly you haven't learned enough along the way that you can't do this next job that you've jumped into.
Yes.
And it becomes a challenge. So either you're going to learn quickly and hold yourself accountable to learn and develop and to grow, or you're going to not succeed at that job. And I see that, unfortunately, as the big risk. And we do see it for people that are jumping quite frequently, is that, I never really got a chance to prove that I know what I was doing at this job, but they're offering me a lot of money
right
for this next one. So I'm going to go there, and then I'm not going to stay there for a year and a half, because I'm never really going to go through enough time there to know that I really mastered that one, and then go on to the next one. Well, you can't do that too many times before it catches up with you. And so there's a few people that make it through, but most people don't.
You're absolutely right. What we see out there, and again, I'm not saying, I'm internally optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature, but many of the challenges we're seeing out there is not only is that jumping taking place, but these folks who have actually never developed core skill sets, capabilities, knowledge, or real experience, they are actually getting promoted into management. So now they're running a team and impacting somewhere between 6 and 9 people in a negative way. And it's one of the things we do, Andy, we, as you would, I'm sure, when you're working with your CEOs and founders, you help them with recruiting, and then you're coaching them on how to interview salespeople. And you're starting to try and find executive recruiters who can help you. And it ends up being, we're the company nobody wants to work with if they're an executive recruiter, because we actually know how to interview somebody. Still a bit of a crapshoot, by the way. Still not a science, according to Frank Zapides, our last guest on the show. But flipping a coin. But at least we have a model or a methodology, whereas the executive recruiters are moving talent around so quickly right now. And most folks don't know how to interview somebody for a sales position. So they'll take anybody, and the churn's just nuts. And so terribly expensive, for the founder, particularly in a small or medium business, just insanely expensive for them.
Well, I think that one of the lessons that is a key lesson that sellers have to learn is patience. It's not like the golden rings are going to disappear, right? But at some point in your career, and I did this. I mean, I went through a period where I went from a startup to another startup. And sort of like my fourth one within about 3 years or 4 years, something like that. After I'd been there for a couple of years, again, I was being approached to leave, and I thought, no, I really need to stay. And part of it was I was working for a great boss who was challenging, but was also giving me, increasing levels of responsibility. I enjoyed what I was doing, but I also just knew in my gut that I could learn more there than going someplace else, and it'd be more beneficial for my career to stick there. And it turned out absolutely to be the case. So I went from being sort of a 1 year type person to stay this place 5 years, and it transformed my career. I mean, it opened up opportunities for me that I'm convinced would never have been open had I left and gone somewhere else, because we went through being acquired. I got put in charge of running international sales. I'd never done international sales before, but the combined companies decided I was the person to run international sales. That led to being recruited by another company, ultimately at the end of that 5-year period, a startup that did quite well, and then another startup did quite well. I mean, just the doors open because I was patient, and I really improved my overall skill set, not just from a selling standpoint, but also from a management standpoint. And if I hadn't listened to my gut and had just sort of followed what everybody else was doing, perhaps I might have got lucky and made a bunch of money somewhere else. But as it turned out pretty well for me.
It's interesting. And certainly I'm not perfect at all, but that idea of finding folks who are senior in a professional environment even in professional selling. But when you kind of cut to the chase to try and understand their core capabilities, they're a little light. There are those opportunities to progress financially without grabbing the learning. And one of the things we try and coach, first of all, we're learners, we're lifelong learners and have this growth orientation, and we like it.
Right.
So we love when we're challenged and learn and all those kinds of things. It's not always comfortable, but I always coach, folks watching this webinar series to say the most important thing in the current job is, what are you learning? Money always ends up coming your way. If you're pretty good at what you do, it'll come your way. Are you getting challenged and learning? And is the organization enabling that? Or are you in a position where the organization is just pulling the learning from you because they actually don't have skill sets and capabilities? So there's a time for that, but you got to make sure you you continue to develop your craft in professional sales. It's not a one and done type of thing. Right. And continuing, just like, and I know you love the references, professional athletes, so do I. The difference is the type of professional athlete. So of course we always use the hockey references. I know you like Liverpool and football.
I do. Yep.
The reason I don't like that sport is my dad was British, but we were raised on Aston Villa. So it's been a long haul. Let's be honest. I'd rather
They're back in Premier League, so that's good.
Yeah, kind of an interesting story to get there. So let's circle.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just to finish up on the point you're talking is, the learning is so critical. And I think, I wrote about this just last week or week before on LinkedIn, is that sort of criteria I use for looking for new jobs was, what I was going to learn from the person that I was going to work with, or the people I was going to work with. And so I found myself very fortunate to get in situations where worked with a number of exceedingly smart people. That was very challenging. And as so my bottom line was, I wanted to go gravitate to places where the challenge scared me, right? And because if I was too comfortable, then I wasn't going to learn. But where I thought not just the opportunity itself was challenging, a little bit frightening, but also the people I was going to work with were so scary smart that I was going to have to really run hard to keep up. And it turned out to work beautifully. And once you work in those environments, it's sort of hard to work in other environments where people collectively, aren't you exercising the same sort of intellectual horsepower, right? About the work and the job and the creativity and what can we do to make things happen?
Boy, does it ever become black and white too. I was privileged to be in that kind of environment for a number of years, doing some really challenging things, huge deals. And the folks I reported to, they weren't easy, by the way. They weren't warm and cuddly. It was a bit of, multipliers in Liz Wiseman, where they're saying, hey, the best multipliers, they're not your best friend. No. But they're going to make sure that you evolve, and they did. And then when I was put in an environment where that wasn't the case, it happened to be, a really good financial opportunity. 90 days later, I just walked away. And it was interesting. I was just so unhappy or disappointed and just thought, I do not see any future here. And frankly, it was one of the joys. It turned out to be one of the best things in my life and my wife's life, because it started this. It was kind of the impetus for what we do now. So Andy, switching around a little bit. So, and you've been at this, you have such access to so many thought leaders in the space. Let's come around to this topic, if we could, of sales management, because you said what was really important to you, and certainly to me, was reporting to great bosses. And, I've heard you mention before, you've been on panels at conferences where thought leaders in technology say they're doing away with the one-on-one, and you're biting your tongue to say, excuse me. I've heard your fantastic podcast with people like Brian Souza, who's built an entire business on just properly managing someone. This is not a new idea. This is just, maybe we'll actually actively manage somebody instead of just count what they do. What is real challenge in sales management today? And what do we do to continue to help these sales leaders who are facing fear, not performing, not lasting too long in their jobs, if you believe some of the statistics, by the way? What do we do to help them?
Well, I think it starts with a change in perspective, right? And this is old wisdom, but it's still the most valid piece of advice that you can give a sales manager is, yeah, you only succeed to the extent that your people succeed. And so, if you're going to boil it down. So I like to boil sales down to just one line, and the same line applies to being a manager as well. So in selling, what you're trying to do is you're trying to listen to understand what's the most important thing to the buyer, and then help them get that. Right at the end of the day, that's what you do.
Mm-hmm.
As a sales manager, what's your job? It's to listen to understand what's the most important thing that's driving and motivating your people, and then help them achieve that. It's the same thing. That's so as a manager, this should be your sole focus. Of course, you want to hit your job and so on, but priority during the day is, hey, what's most important? What's driving my people? How do I really understand them? As a manager, if you do nothing else but read and reread and commit to memory and implement the teachings from the book, The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay Stanier, you'll be so far ahead of the game, because that teaches you how to coach in a way that develops the skills of your people. And when we say skills, it's not like coaching to develop presentation skills. It's ultimately, at the end of the day, as a seller, you are a problem solver, right? You're going in to understand what's this most important thing to a buyer, both from a problem and an outcome standpoint. You got to solve that problem for them, right? With them. You're going to work with your buyer to help them solve, identify, define, solve a problem.
Yeah.
And you're doing the same thing with your employees. I told Michael, when he's been on the show several times, I said, you didn't realize you wrote a great sales book, because that whole methodology that he implements is 7 questions going through, and the way you coach an individual is how you interact with a buyer as well. And it just starts and ends with the people. And if you're not focused on that, if you think that you can drive people to, it's all about the numbers and the metrics, and certainly sales is a number game to a certain degree. There's always going to be reduced to numbers, but it's a human business, both in the sellers to the buyers and you to your sellers. And the way you interact with them is going to be very similar.
Yeah. Well, I love The Coaching Habit, by the way. And for those listening who haven't read it, first of all, it's a weekend read, but it's amazing to me.
Yeah.
He's a little bit to me of that. I know Albert Einstein didn't say it, but we give him credit for, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. Always a credit to Einstein. It was actually a physicist who actually came up with that quote, but that book is so clearly written.
Yep.
And I'm in the middle of my first book, and it's not clearly written. And we're going to have to keep going back and back and back. And it sets the bar so incredibly high, it's intimidating. But
I've used it as the bar for my book, for sure. I mean, actually, I'm working with the same publishing company that Michael worked with on that book. And okay. That's been my model for my book. That's new book coming out in February.
So that's a good, nice transit. What is the new book, and what's the topic on the new book? What are we going to get in addition to what we've already got with Amp Up and Zero Time?
Yeah, I'm just not talking about the book a whole lot yet. We will starting this fall for sure, in advance of the launch. But it's written for the individual contributor mostly. Okay. There's something in there for managers. The first 2 books are more manager oriented, perhaps, but it's around this theme of how you grab control of your own destiny in sales. And really, as I like to do, as you pointed out, I like to take complex things and make them very simple. And I think I've simplified the perspective that sellers need to have very simply in every interaction they have with the buyer. And just keep in mind is that, this is still a human business, and people are buying from you. And this is a consistent theme through everything I've written and talk about. And it's just, how do you help the buyer make their decision?
And today, where do you think the biggest gap is on that? By the way, there was spectacular content, I thought, in Zero Time and Amp Up for the direct contributor. Yeah,
there is. Yeah, I was sort of, the person I had in mind when I was writing it was a manager, but it's for them as well. But it's, the biggest gap, I think, is this perspective, just the wrong perspective about what selling is. And so I just, sort of foreshadowed it before. I said, what is selling? And I said, if you just keep in mind that your only job is to listen, to understand what's the most important thing to the buyer. If you do that, there's always one thing that's most important.
Yeah.
And I've given lots of examples on my show and talked to people in the past about even on very large deals. My experience is always, and I'm talking, worth tens of millions of dollars, is that there's always one thing that's more important than all the others. And there's always one person that's more important than all the others, one stakeholder. And if you can identify what that is and who they are, you're way ahead of the game. And this is what your focus has to be as a seller. It's just, and so with the book, one thing we're trying to do is really draw a line in the sand and say, in the past, maybe you got away with some of these traditionally salesy behaviors that were just the buyers sort of cringeworthy, the buyers had to suffer through.
Right.
But we're drawing a line in the sand, and that time's done. And there's absolutely no reason to engage in any of that prototypically salesy behaviors from this point forward. And you're just doing yourself a disservice if you do. And so it comes out very strongly about that as well.
Well, getting that messaging from such a thought leader like you with your reach, I think is so important, Andy, because today somebody gave me a stat, and this, I'm not sure there's a perfect fact, but it was Canadian University top MBA school, said most MBA students, when they're going through the program, they either want to go into investment banking or consulting.
Right.
But about a third of them, and even a little bit higher, will end up in a professional sales job. And I think one of the reasons that, a lot of these MBA students don't go through saying, I want to be in a professional sales job. Number one, there's no courses on sales in MBA programs for the most part.
Right.
Number two, so they think it's a trade, not a profession. But number two, I think there are these 35-year-old stereotypes, of course, of professional selling, Gil from The Simpsons, all these types of things, where people think they're going to have to do a whole bunch of things that is just not in their nature. Like, you've got to close them.
Yeah. No, I agree.
We get that question so often, what's my best closing technique? The best closing technique is actually do a better discovery and listen with better questions.
Exactly. It's like, as I tell people, so let me ask you a question. And this is not to you, Mark, but to the audience in general, but it's like, assuming you're not in insurance sales and you're not selling cars, B2B, how often have you been in the room when the customer made their decision? Right. Almost never. I mean, I've been in the room when mentally I can see the switch being flipped. It's like, oh yeah, I've got this, but I wasn't, there wasn't the order. I wasn't done. Yeah, we indulge in all these wrong ideas of what selling is that continue to persist.
Right.
And they're of no value to the buyers at all. And so we can go through any sales methodology that's being taught, and you can say, okay, well, how does this help the buyer define their problem? How does it help the buyer decide how they want to solve their problem? How does it help the buyer choose who they want to solve their problem with?
Right.
And they don't. And so it's long overdue. And we've got this, to your point about the MBAs, they've got minds or these stereotypical ideas of sellers that they see in popular culture and, movies and TV shows and so on. And yet we're still teaching people that, right? I mean, perfect example is Jonah Berger in his book, The Catalyst. And he's a professor at Wharton. I had him on the show a little over a year ago. And it's a book about helping people change their minds. And I like the book. I mean, with certain things we didn't agree on, but he cites research that shows that humans universally react negatively to attempts to persuade them. And yet he calls it persuasion reactance. I call it persuasion resistance, but whatever. Is the fact is we spend billions of dollars every year training sellers in the one behavior that everybody universally hates. How does that make sense? And so it's like, we don't need to do that. I mean, we can influence the choices our buyers make without having to resort to heavy-handed persuasion. Yet,
It doesn't,
this is how we teach sellers.
this is certainly it's how some people teach sellers. Where I think the huge opportunity is, Andy, I think the huge opportunity is if people really understood what it took to do large deals.
Mhm.
You don't force somebody into a large deal. You don't close somebody for $100 million transaction because you had the right turn of phrase, on a phone call, and you handled their objection.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
just not how it's good.
not-
You
yeah.
don't do it. Now,
Right.
there is some objection. There is natural resistance at the start of a sales cycle where an SDR can get through and so forth. But I think if people actually knew what's really involved, where you've got to be intellectually curious, you solve problems for a client, you work on very interesting problems, I think there'd be a whole different makeup of people who want to get into professional sales.
I agree.
Instead of those folks who get into professional sales because it seems to be the most professional role they can get with no formal specific, certification or training. And by the way, I think the other challenge we've got right now is because of the churn and the way large technology companies are handling some recruiting because of their challenges, it's just terrible the way they'll hire 30 people, put them through a process and keep 12.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm actually worried about the other 18, not just from a sales perspective, but what did we do to a young person,
Oh, I agree.
their first job and they lost it? As you said, when you went through your Burroughs experience, that, when the guy read the letter saying, fire this guy, I can't imagine the trauma of hearing that, by the way. But
I survived. No, the trauma was, oh shit, I have to tell my parents.
exactly. Can you imagine the embarrassment?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, he was good humored about it. Yeah, I think that again, a lot of it comes down to we just have to change perspectives, right? So in my career, when I was growing teams and tech startups, is I often brought people in from engineering. We're like complex technical products. I brought people in from engineering to become salespeople. And to a person, the first reaction was, well, I can't do that. I said, why? I says, well, I can't persuade somebody to buy something they don't want. I said, well, that's not what sales is about.
Mm-hmm.
Sales are just problem solvers. Isn't that what you do as an engineer? Solve problems? Oh yeah, that's exactly what I do. Oh, great. Well, come to sales. This is what we do.
Sharp end of the stick.
Sharp end of the stick. So, we're talking about kids at MBA and level and top grads that, yeah, they've got the choice of consulting and sure they can go burn themselves out, make a fair amount of money, make more money perhaps quicker than they could in sales. But yeah, after spending 24 months not sleeping on an airplane, some of the magic goes away of that. Same with investment banking is, yeah, problem solvers, professional problem solvers. This is what we do. And this perspective becomes so important because, and again, this is sort of the disservice you talked before. You lose deals in discovery. Here's a perfect example of that. Is we have our playbooks, we have scripted lists of questions, we send sellers out to gather this information. They come back and they've got the information, but they don't understand it.
Right.
And so in my mind, I like to call, we've got this huge gap between knowing and understanding. We know a bunch of stuff. We don't understand it. We don't understand the context. We don't understand how it applies to the buyers. We don't understand what's the most important thing to them because we just ask the questions we're supposed to ask and we don't keep digging and digging and digging and being curious. It's a change of perspective, right? If the perspective is, look, you're trying to find out what's the most important thing to the buyer and don't you come back till you know that. If a boss said that to somebody, you can guarantee you coach them to do that. They'd be asking better questions. They'd be asking more follow-up questions, being relentless and persistent with it. Because I've never had the experience of a buyer saying, oh, enough questions, right?
Right.
Like, as long as you're sincere and you're trying to learn, and they know you're there to try to help them, right? Because you haven't said, oh, well, let's get this done in 2 weeks so I get you in by the end of the month. But as long as you're being clear about your motives, they'll give you the time because they're benefiting from, they're learning from your questions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Andy, as long as you've got trust and credibility. And
Yes.
so it might be an amp up.
Yeah.
But trust and credibility. And I think that's a huge gap in general training and sales training today. I think understandably, I certainly didn't have any when I was coming out of college or university. Before the MBA, I didn't have any. Business acumen. So just understanding how businesses work and, the different disciplines, and maybe having some knowledge of core financial models at a very high level. We try and help folks with, we call it just a mini MBA module.
Great.
Let's just go through some of the basics, and so people get comfortable, because most businesses, the way you size them up, they're remarkably similar. Sell a product and service to a certain market. They have a value proposition of how they can compete and win. They have a distribution model, profit, expense, EBITDA,
right.
Revenue growth, good, EBITDA growth, fantastic. So you can help them with some of those things, so they have a little bit more confidence to earn that trust and credibility. And there's so many great resources these days for that lifelong learning to help.
Absolutely, you should, and you should do that. I just insert is that thing is, so you're going to learn a lot of that if you just ask questions of your buyers. I mean, for me, I was selling to small and mid-sized businesses, oftentimes to the CEOs, the entrepreneurs, the founders themselves, selling accounting systems. And God, that was my MBA right there, just talking to these people. But I could have been superficial about it, but it's just who I am. Very curious, always willing to ask an extra question. And, these people opened up. Yeah, it was credibility. Not like I had credibility, but I had credibility in the sense that I was sincere about the fact that I wanted to learn about what was important to them. And they were willing to spend the time to share that knowledge with me. I mean, when I graduated from college, I looked 16. I mean, I was, if anybody, kids are a wonder anybody talked to me. But yeah, they took me seriously because I was sincere in my interest, in my curiosity. And yeah, first 4 years selling these types of systems to businesses, first year or 4 years of my career, that was my MBA right there.
Fantastic. And also, you're sincere, but there's no question you would have been prepared. Yeah. So I think that's the other thing. You're not asking a question, hey, what's keeping you up at night? I think buyers are so tired of just these silly questions. But if it looks like you've done some modicum of research to earn the right to proceed with a question, or to earn the right with that authentic research. I mean, I can't believe how many sales training companies do demand generation with us, reaching out, and no one's taken any time to know anything about us. And without opening a gate here, it would be so easy to cold call me, because all you have to do is say, I watched your value proposition video online. It looks fantastic. Let me practice this. Does it work? I feel so compelled to get back to them because of, Cialdini's theory of reciprocity. I wouldn't be able to stop myself from picking up the phone and returning the call.
You would be surprised how many times people reach out to me and say, on LinkedIn, and said, I've looked on your LinkedIn profile. Sometimes it's email, but mostly LinkedIn. I've looked on your LinkedIn profile. I think you'd be a great candidate to start a podcast.
You know what? I don't do this anymore. I keep those.
Yeah.
And I just try and I'll genericize them. I'll make sure I protect the innocent, or the guilty I protect.
Guilty, yes.
But I use them in training because it's hard to believe that still exists in this day and age, but it does.
Oh,
hey, boy, this could go on. I know maybe not for you. I could talk to you for hours. Neil, hey, Neil, I'm going to just throw it over to you. Do we have a couple of questions? I just want to make sure the audience gets a chance to engage here. Neil, do we have a couple of questions, one or two for Andy to share?
Yeah, hi, everyone. So we got a couple of questions here. So I think I'll start with, is sales productivity improving or not, given all the new sales enablement technology that we use today?
Sounds like a setup.
Somebody's read your books, by the way.
Yeah. The answer is no, unfortunately. And we don't have great data. Part of it depends on how you define productivity. I've got a very specific definition, which I think is the right definition. I'm not trying to be egocentric about this. I just think that we should define productivity in sales the same way we define it in every other aspect of our economy, which is a rate of output per unit of input. And so in terms of dollars generated per hour of actual selling time, there's no data to suggest that sales productivity has improved over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, talking to Frank Cespedes, as a matter of fact, when he was on my show earlier this year, a professor at Harvard School of Business, he thinks, as I do, based on the data, such a data that does exist, is, if anything, it's probably fallen in terms of the rate of output per individual seller. And you can't blame it on the technology necessarily, but I think it's a number of factors that are playing in there. And part of it is just the way we manage the process. Part of it is, we've gone through this period largely driven through technology sales of extremely low win rates, low close rates, lots of do not decides or no decisions.
Yeah.
So, and there's, again, we could spend hours just dissecting that. But to answer your question, it seems not to have. And when you look at the impact of technology in general on productivity in general in our economy, at least in the US, that number is slowed to a trickle. And Paul Krugman has written extensively about it. And you look at sort of the trends, it seems like the things that really drove productivity improvement were first email and then broadband. And since then, technology's had seemingly a minor impact on general business productivity.
Very, very interesting. We've had Frank as a guest, and I love his books too. We talked about sales management that works, and he's got some great perspectives on lots of things. And it's great to see somebody like that at that level at Harvard focused on sales.
Yeah.
Like to see professional sales in academia. Neil, do we have one more question for Andy from the gang?
Yeah, there's one more here. What attributes do you look for when hiring salespeople?
Again, broad question, but I think one that perhaps, I love curiosity. That's one of my favorites. But coachability, right, is if you're a manager who's sincere about wanting to coach and you want to help your people improve and develop and become the best version of themselves, then there has to be people who are open to being coached. And so I remember had a conversation with Mark Roberge, who was one of the early people at HubSpot.
Predictable revenue? Oh, HubSpot, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, and his was the Sales Acceleration Formula, was his book.
Right.
And a great book. But what he talked about when they were interviewing in HubSpot in the early days when he was there is they'd bring candidates in and they would give them some coaching on something and then have them go back, some period of time, I don't know, 45 minutes, half hour, whatever, and then have them come back in and sort of, they go through it again and see if they accepted the coaching. And so what they're looking for is people to be able to, who want to be, who are open, right? That's being a part of being a problem solver, is being open to input about how I might be able to solve a problem. And so I think coachability is at the top of the list, along with curiosity, I think is really important. And just the ability to connect with people as a human being, really important. I mean, we're still in a human business. This is not going to change for quite some time. And just not that you have to be an extrovert by any stretch of the imagination, but just, if you're curious about people, you show interest in other people, that can help form that connection.
Yeah. We always like, Andy, a question in interviews, which is, what's the next thing you need to learn? And trying going down the Carol Dweck path of growth orientation or fixed mindset, just see where somebody's at.
Yep.
And see how they respond to that question. You're incredibly well read. What are the top 2 or 3 sources that you go to, Andy, for reference material or information or insight on professional selling? What are your sources of data and information that you like? A couple of them, a few of them for the team.
I mean, LinkedIn is still a way to sort of see what's happening and then drill down using other resources. Harvard Business Review writes pretty well about sales. They've got a fair amount of research, so I'm a subscriber to that. I read the articles, but not just sales, but everything that could affect sales. And then for me, it's really my podcast, because I talk to so many people that have written books, not just about selling. I mean, and I just one correction too, Mark, is on, because I know we changed it, but the name of the podcast currently is the Sales Enablement Podcast.
I'm sorry.
That changed. We were acquired a couple of years ago. Yeah. But people I talk to on my show that write books about things that aren't about sales per se, but do relate to sales when you read them with a sales lens. Just had a great guest, Juliet Funt, wrote a book called A Minute to Think about how to give yourself time in the day just to really think, right? Which is, we all need this to process better, to be creative, about what we're doing. So yeah, my podcast, and when people come on, they're guests and they've got books, I read their books. I'm a little unusual that way for a podcast host. I actually read their books. And so, yeah, I've had the chance to read hundreds and hundreds of really interesting books. So yeah, that's for me.
I'll double down on that, gang. I may not know the title of the podcast, but I've actually listened to a lot of episodes in the podcast. I'm not up to all 953 or whatever the number is.
About that, yeah.
But,
I think now, yeah.
Yeah, but just absolutely spectacular.
Well, thank you.
Hey, Andy, just as we round things up here. So first of all, just an enormous pleasure talking to you.
Well, this was fun. I always enjoy talking with you, Mark.
Yeah, really, really great to have you on the show and chat with you. And I'm sure everybody's learned just a ton. How would people learn more if they want to engage, they want to move forward? What's the best way of learning more about Andy Paul?
Go to LinkedIn. So the usual preamble / real Andy Paul. And yeah, we post at least once a day, if not more. And trying to give people things to think about, right? And that's, for me, it's more than specific tactics. So we do share stuff. It's change. We need changes in perspective. And so I spend a lot of time writing about how to look at what you're doing in a way that's different, that will inform how you can become better at it. And I've always thought, first and foremost, I wrote about that in Zero Time Selling, is sales is a creative thinking person's game. And if you just want to be rote and go through the steps, probably not the right profession for you. But if you want to be creative in your daily work, which I think we all love, right? That's so enriching. Then it's a perfect profession.
Oh, that's really well said. And I might ask you to share your philosophy on life. I was watching a few other podcasts that you'd been on. And you talked about Thomas Huxley. Tell me about that quote, because I think it's so incredibly appropriate for somebody in professional sales.
Yeah, so Thomas Huxley was a writer, a British writer at the end of the 19th century, related to Aldous Huxley, that wrote a famous book, Brave New World. And he said that in life, you should try to learn something about everything and everything about something. And I read that years and years and years ago, and it's always sort of informed my perspective on the world. Is you want to read widely, you want to learn as much as you can, be interested in as many things as you possibly can be, because I can't recount the number of times I've been in conversations where with buyers in foreign countries, or even here in the US, where I came up with something that I read that led to an interesting conversation, maybe not even about what we're selling perhaps, but help form that connection with somebody. And so read widely and then read deeply. If you're in sales, the one thing you should know everything about is how to sell and how buyers buy. I mean, the books are out there. You don't have to agree with all of it. I mean, you don't have to agree with everything I write, because everybody's going to sell a little bit differently. Hopefully that message is clear. I'm not going to sell the way Mark sells. Mark's never going to sell the way I sell. That's the fallacy of some of the methodologies we learn. Is you got to become the best version of yourself. And so, if there's 5 million people engaged in B2B selling in the United States, we have 5 million distinct methodologies. So invest the time to learn to create your own.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Listen, Andy, on behalf of our whole team and me, thanks a million for joining. Really, really looking forward to joining for your podcast on Friday. Yep. I'm actually with you back on Friday.
Yep.
And enjoy your birthday.
Oh, thank you.
So this working to 9:30 stuff doesn't sound the best to me in terms of enjoying your birthday.
They're not as, in some ways they're not as significant as they were before, but in other ways, as you get older, they become more significant. But we celebrate them more continuously year round, I think, than just on the day.
Yeah. Well, listen, you take care, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you again at the end of the week. And folks,
right. Thanks to everybody for joining.